Good morning again. My friend Stephen is a Lutheran minister in Nashville, Tennessee. We both got to know each other when we were both young pastors starting at our same churches in Amarillo, Texas. His Lutheran church was just down the street from mine. And as I got to know Stephen, I noticed he would do this thing all the time. I noticed at first, I came to a meeting at his church, and it was a rainy day, and when he saw that it was raining, he went out and he stood in the rain, and he turned around with this big goofy smile on his face, and he said, "Remember your baptism and be thankful." Or another time, he and a few of us that were all young clergy persons, we kind of had this little friendship circle. We all rented this house on a lake in Texas. And when we got to the lake, he was just so excited, and he got out and he walked out into the water up to his knees, and same thing, he turned around and there was that same goofy smile, and he said, "Remember your baptism and be thankful." And even there was this one time, because we would have Friday night dinners where we would rotate to different people's houses, and his daughter, who was maybe 2 or 3 at the time, she spilled her cup of water and it sloshed across the table. And you know that got to remember your baptism and be thankful. And the first time he did it, I thought, baptism, great, it's water. But it got to the point where every time we would pass a lawn with sprinklers going off, we would get, "I'll remember your baptism and be thankful." Now, Stephen didn't do this because, just because Lutherans are lovable weirdos. He did it because he was remembering that something Martin Luther said. And he once wrote that there is on earth no greater comfort than baptism. There is on earth no greater comfort than baptism. Of all the things we do in church, why is that the thing that Luther looked to? What is it about baptism that brings comfort? We perform baptisms often enough. We do it here at St. John's, of course. Most of the time when we do baptisms here, it's babies that are coming forward to be baptized, and parents bring their babies, and they're dressed, a lot of times they're dressed all in white, and I hope in an infant baptism that the infant, kind of wiggles a little bit or starts crying. Or does babies are good at doing things that are cute. And you kind of hope that they do something like that in baptism. And then we sprinkle a little water and we say some prayers. And that's how we practice it. Today, of course, is Baptism of the Lord Sunday. And we'll remember our baptism at the end of the service by touching water. And when you do, I will say, or Molly will say to you, "Remember your baptism and be thankful," which is a silly thing for us to say, because if you did grow up United Methodist, you probably don't remember your baptism because you were one of those babies. And actually, I think that's the start of a good thought about baptism, whether you were baptized as an infant or not. And here's why. If you were baptized as an infant, you didn't bring yourself. You didn't do anything. Other people prayed over you. Other people prepared you. A power bigger than yourself, namely your parents, got you ready and brought you for baptism. And that's grace. You weren't baptized under your own steam. And it wasn't your inherent goodness or holiness that got you there. In fact, even if you were a thinking, self-realized, older child or adult when you were baptized, I think the same is true, that it really, when you were baptized, it wasn't your choosing baptism where you found the grace. It was in the gift. It was from God. We're talking in these 4 weeks about places in life where we need God. Because the truth is, in modern life, there are a lot of places where it would be, and often is, very easy for us to think that we don't need God. We live in a rational world. We don't want to be superstitious or things like that. We live in a world where we're chasing after the contemporary. But for all the ways that we are rational, powerful, thinking, self-sustaining people, there are a few places in the human experience where we have a deep need for God. And we're going to touch on 4 in January, the 4 of those things. Last week we talked about awe. That awe is that feeling of joy that's just bigger than us. It's that joy when you're looking into a starry sky and you really see, the full magnitude of the universe around us, or you're holding a flower, even like a dandelion or something, and you can see the intricate design and the beauty and the detail of what makes a flower a flower. Or it can be when you look in the face of a partner or a trusted friend and say, I love you, to them. Those are moments of awe. Those moments show us how small and lucky we are for being safe and warm in the grandiosity of the universe. It produces awe. But there are other places too. And one of them where we need God, I really believe, is sort of in the opposite of that, and that's grief. I think in a lot of ways grief actually produces moments of awe, but grief is also in some ways the antithesis of awe, because, have you ever been grieving and it felt overwhelming? I mean, it did just feel bigger than you. It's something that you couldn't get over or around. If awe shows us how lucky we are to occupy some small little bit of a world of beauty, grief just can make us feel small. And here's where I'm going with this. Baptism, we talk about baptism in lots of ways, but baptism is a gift that God gives us to know and find hope in grief. I think baptism is rooted in grief. Baptism is a good place to go when we are grieving. Sometimes, and in some traditions, we talk about baptism as death, that we die to ourselves or to our old selves and to sin, and so it's in that way it's about death. And sometimes, and in some traditions, we talk about baptism as cleansing or washing, that we wash our sins away. And if you've ever been to a church and they say, you have to be washed in the blood of a lamb. There's an image that you really need at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning for yourself. Just wash yourself in blood. There's theological meaning behind it. Or sometimes, and in some traditions, we talk about baptism as being like birth, where you rise with Christ and you're reborn with Christ. You're born into God's family in baptism. And each one of those metaphors is right in its own way and in its place. But all 3 of those are presented all 3 of those metaphors present baptism as a place of implicit need, and where grief kind of comes alongside in baptism. Because in grief, a part of our life is dying or being lost. And a part of our life is in need of newness. And we sense that. We may not know the way to it, but we sense it. A part of our life is being reborn. And it's painful. Grief emerges when we lose something or someone we love, and it's almost this feeling of being out of control. Have you ever been grieving before and felt like life is just not in my control anymore? We can't master it. We can't go around it or ignore it. We just have to ride that wave of grief and see where it will take us. We can do it well, but that doesn't mean we're in control. And baptism likewise is an act of surrender, where we let God's grace take us where we'll go. We're stripped of the illusion of being self-sufficient in both, and in both there's hope. Mostly in baptism we see that the things that grieve God, God's response to that is mercy. God doesn't lash out. God washes us. God bathes us in love. And the same, when we grieve, the best response to grief is mercy, whether it's with yourself or with others. So when you're grieving, be merciful with yourself. Be patient with yourself. When you see others that are grieving, be merciful with them. Be with them in the moment without having to fix it or make it right. It's the best thing you can do in grief is be merciful. The psychologist Robert Nehemiah writes, the central process in grieving is the attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that's been challenged by loss. That's easy to write in a textbook, but it's also excruciating. But there's still a kernel of hope. There's still this thread, because just as we die, so does Christ, and we will rise on the other side with him. We even see that in the gospel lesson. I think this story of Jesus' baptism is so weird, because when Jesus goes down and he comes back up, there's that voice from the heavens, and it said, "Behold my son, in whom I am well pleased." And what's weird to me in that is, aside from the fact that does Jesus need to be baptized, is why then? We're in chapter 1 of Mark. Jesus hasn't started his ministry yet, and God is already pleased. He hasn't cleansed a leper. He hasn't taught a Sunday school lesson yet. And yet, he calls Jesus beloved. I think that God gives us in baptism, and Luther knows this when he writes that there's no greater comfort, that whatever life has already sent our way and whatever will come, it's God saying, I'm here with you. I'm with you in this. So Jesus was baptized. And here's what I mean about that, and here's why I think baptism is all about grief. And to explain this, let me pull up a picture. I sent this in. Let me pull it up on the media so you can call attention to it. It's actually 2 pictures. These are both pictures of my friend and colleague Steve Porch. He's a United Methodist pastor in Fort Smith, Arkansas. I saw this on social media this week, and I knew I had to share it. And I called him. I did get permission to share this because I think that's important, and sometimes I don't do that. But these 2 pictures he posted on social media this week. Now, Steve is a great pastor and leader, and when he posted these 2 pictures, it was sort of a teaching moment that he was kind enough to let me share as well. Now, the picture on the left is of Steve and his wife, Marie. They're on their first date. It's 1982. Look at those clothes. Look at those haircuts. I kind of like the hair in that picture. We don't do hair like that anymore. Not that it matters. But they're on their first date. He took her to Six Flags Over Texas. They grew up in the Dallas area. And, when you go to amusement parks and they have those people around who will take your pictures so that hopefully you'll fork over a few bucks and buy that picture at the end of the day to remember it. Well, he was on his first date. Of course, he was going to buy that picture, and he did. And they didn't know it when someone snapped that shot. They were on their first date, but that's sort of like a recording of the beginning of a 42-year story for Steve and Marie. And then we come to the picture on the right, which is the last or one of the last pictures that they took together, where Steve is holding Marie as she's dying of cancer. And it wasn't long after that picture was taken that he lost her. And yes, I got permission to share this, but I don't think I need to explain the emotion of that moment, as Steve, who is a shepherd of many in Fort Smith and well beyond, he's holding Marie, who's tired, and he's holding her so tenderly. And I had to share this, and I'm so honored that he's willing to allow it, because here's what he wrote in the caption. These pictures were taken 42 years apart, one near the beginning, one near the end. One of the first pics of us standing hand in hand, and the very last pic of us standing in an embrace. And we went through a lot in those 42 years in between, and some of it was as tough as HE double hockey sticks, as my dad would say. But it ended the way it started, holding on to each other in love. I miss that part so much. And I think about that, and in addition to Steve's grace and humility and openness in sharing, and there's still struggles for him. He's pretty open about that too. Every day is a new challenge when you're grieving. But I think about that but that sort of dynamic every time we bring a little baby or an adult forward for baptism, that we don't know what the future holds with this person's story. There could be struggles. There will be struggles. The future is a mystery. And when we come in baptism to God, we're embracing a trust that God will carry us through. And so, most of the time when we bring people to be baptized in church, we talk about the happy, easy parts, the new life and new birth, and God is doing something new. But I also hope that in our hardest times, folks, I hope God holds us with the same love and tenderness that Steve's holding his wife in that picture. And the promise is that God's faithfulness is there. God's faithfulness wraps us up like water. And we're not just sprinkling, you can take the picture down. We're not just, in baptism, we're not just sprinkling a little water and saying some magic words. A promise is being born that'll carry us through the agony of what life can dole out. Grief expert David Kessler says each person's grief is as unique as a fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean needing someone to try to reframe it for them or lessen it. What they need is someone to be fully present in the magnitude of their loss. And I think maybe that's what God also gives us in baptism. In fact, in the United Methodist tradition, we don't do private baptisms. You can't just have me come to your house and do a baptism. We do it in front of others. We celebrate it and mark it together as a community. And baptism is knowing that in spite of everything, our mistakes, our past, our need to be right, our need to be first and loudest, our regrets, our shame, our loss. Baptism is God saying, I'm here with you in this. So we talk about the nice side of baptism, especially with new believers and outsiders, but the rebirth. But the promise is that God is there with us in the joy and the newness, and no less in the moments where we struggle and we feel the water over our heads, looking for hope. Because at its core, baptism is God saying, even when we cannot see a way forward, God holding us in our pain and carrying us into new life. So why do we need God? Well, in part because when I feel grief, there's always this fear that it's a permanent condition. Like, how could I ever feel whole again? That grief will just be drowning where nothing emerges. But as Anne Lamott writes, grief and tears didn't wash me away. They gave me my life back. They cleansed me. They baptized me. They hydrated the earth at my feet. Maybe this is the one thing that we miss out on in United Methodism and other traditions where we're just sprinklers instead of dunkers. I'll immerse her. I should use the right term. Immerse, if we don't do immersion, is that it's not just that the body goes under the water. If we were dunkers, we'd see that the body also comes back up. There's a visual liturgy there that there will be a tomorrow. Henry Nouwen writes, what do we do with our losses? We must mourn our losses. We cannot talk or act them away, but we can shed tears over them and allow ourselves to grieve deeply. Our grief makes us experience the abyss of our own life in which nothing is settled or clear or obvious, but everything is constantly shifting and changing. But in the midst of all this pain, there is a strange, shocking, yet very surprising voice. It's the voice of the one who says, "Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted." That's the unexpected news. There's a blessing in our grief. It's not those who comfort who are blessed, but those who mourn. Somehow in the midst of our tears, a gift is hidden. Somehow in the midst of our mourning, the first steps of the dance take place. Somehow the cries that well up from our losses belong to our songs of gratitude. And so I go back to my friend Stephen, the Lutheran in Tennessee, who walks into the rain and he says, "Remember your baptism," and he dips his toes in the waters of streams and rivers and does the same. And I ask you to remember your baptism, because God holds you in the water. We're formed in water. Our mothers carried us in the water of a womb. We're birthed in it. And in the good times, God is there, yes. But folks, in our loss, in our pain, in our grief, God's love bathes us. God's love holds us. God brings us through death and loss, and God raises us with Christ. So remember your baptism and be thankful. Let us pray. Holy God, in water we find hope. In death we find resurrection. In birth we find a new start. And even in grief we find new life. We remember our baptisms and we are thankful. Thanks be to God. Amen.